So welcome to this week's Optimum Health Clinic Facebook Live, and apologies running a little bit later than planned. So tonight I wanted to talk specifically about an element of the helper pattern, which is the tendency to try to feel like we can fill up the emotional holes in other people. And what I mean by that is if somebody else is feeling deficient in some way, feeling unhappy, feeling depressed, feeling jealous, envious, whatever it may be. If we have a helper pattern, our belief can be that if we are being nurturing of them, supportive of them, listening to them, encouraging them, that we can fill up that emotional hole in them. And the way I think about it, it's almost like a big well. If you imagine, if perhaps when you were a kid throwing pennies into a wishing well, and you kind of throw your penny in and it's kind of a long kind of fall, and eventually you hit this plop as it kind of hits the bottom. And when we're emotionally deficient, that's often what it feels like inside. Like there's this huge empty kind of space inside of us that we are looking to get filled up through contact and nourishment and support from other people. And so if we're a helper, what we'll tend to find is that we get rather easily attracted to people that have that kind of emotional deficiency. It's almost like we can sniff them out in a crowd, and if that's your kind of resonance, there's almost like a codependency that forms between those that are emotionally deficient and looking to others to fill them up, and those that are defining their self-worth or their kind of self-love by their ability to give to others, to try and fill up that emotional well in others. The problem is that no one can fill up somebody else's deficiency. You can make someone feel better for an hour or for an afternoon or for a day or so. But fundamentally, if the hole is within somebody else and you're having to constantly kind of pour your positive energy, your optimism, your love, your care into that hole, then what you do is you create a dependency upon them that they continue to believe that the nourishment that they need exists outside of them. So it's almost like having a drug addict who's addicted to drugs, and in a sense, each time they come for a hit, you give them a little hit, which continues the dependency. Whereas at some point, ultimately, they're going to have to go some sort of cold turkey. They're going to have to go through some kind of withdrawal to recognize that the state or the uplift they're trying to get through taking drugs doesn't exist on the outside. Ultimately, what they're looking for exists on the inside. This kind of over-emotional giving, where we're trying to fill up someone that's deficient, is also extremely tiring. That's why we talk in the context of ME chronic fatigue about a helper type, because it is an energy depleting psychology. It's a way of approaching other people in the world which is fundamentally draining and depleting. And I think a helpful kind of visual image to think about this is it is literally like someone has a well that's empty and they have all the resources they need to fill up that well. The problem is they're not utilizing their resources. So instead, you're throwing in pennies, and these pennies represent your own emotional kind of resources, your own emotional energy. So you're throwing in pennies and you're pouring in bags of pennies. You're pouring in £10 notes, £20 notes. But however much you pour in, it's like just pouring money into a wishing well, and it just drops down to the bottom, and it doesn't even touch the sides. It doesn't have any kind of meaningful impact in terms of filling up that hole. And so if we can recognize that, we can also recognize somewhat the kind of codependency element here, that it's like as much as that person is trying to get themselves filled up from the outside, we're also trying to define our self-worth by the act of giving to others. And ultimately that isn't healthy and that isn't sustainable. If we switch metaphors for a moment, it's a little bit like being on an aeroplane and the oxygen mask come out because of the pressure. And we start trying to put the oxygen mask onto the people we love around us. The problem is, once we've done one or two people, we run out of oxygen because we haven't got our own mask on, and we pass out, and we're no longer able to help anyone. If we take the time to put our own oxygen mask on first, then we can support anyone that we need to because we've got our own supply and our own support. Same is true on the recovery path. If what you're doing is you're consistently taking care of others but not taking care of yourself, you won't be able to sustain the process of doing it. And it may well have been a factor in causing you to get ill in the first place, and it may well be a factor of perpetuating the state of being ill. So it can be difficult when we're in a codependent pattern. It can be difficult for us as much as difficult for the other person to break free of the pattern, because what starts to happen is what comes up is our inner critic. We start to feel guilty. We start to beat ourselves up. We start to tell ourselves things like, that person needs us. Without us, they're going to collapse. They're going to fall apart. Now, obviously, there are appropriate parameters here, and I'm not saying that you should become a completely heartless, uncaring person. Obviously, people that we love and care about in our life, there's a kind of give and take in terms of how relationships work. And if we want to be able to give and take in a sustainable way, we need to do it from a healthy and functional place, not just doing it from a place of reacting to the habit of how we've always done it in the past. So it's one of those things, a phrase that I use a lot, and I think it's a helpful one in this context, is if you can see it, you don't have to be it. And the more clearly you see it, the easier it is to not be it. So if you can see that there are people in your life that you have these kinds of unhealthy patterns with, where you're throwing your resources down a bottomless pit and it's not really making a difference, remembering that firstly, no outside person can fill somebody else's bottomless pit. And it's not bottomless if they start to fill it up themselves with their own self-care and self-love and self-worth and those sorts of things. Also seeing our role in terms of if you're getting your own kind of ego support from the self-image of being a kind of helper, working to get some freedom and distance from that, and recognizing that in a sense your own well, because in a strange way you're giving to them because you're trying to fill up your own well of self-importance, comes not from those actions of being a helper, but comes from the recognition of the self-love and self-care which actually already is there. And it's not an act of doing, it's an act of being and reconnecting to that place. This is one of those ones that's it's not easy. It's relatively easy to talk about it kind of in a context like this. It's one of those ones that can be extremely difficult in our own lives to actually implement and to change. And certainly it's been true for me in my life that certain members of my own family and people which ultimately I love and care about, I've had to learn to be quite firm and at times what might appear as being quite cold in terms of ensuring that healthy and appropriate boundaries are there. And the thing that really helped me in the recognition of that was the realization that there was no amount of helping or caring or giving that I could give towards certain people that was actually ever going to touch the sides anyway. I.e., it was a completely pointless exercise. It's one thing if someone has, let's say, a physical injury, and so someone breaks their leg and they need some care and support to rest and recover to heal the leg. And so being in a kind of helping, supportive role around that may well be entirely appropriate. If someone's got a kind of a deficiency on the inside, it's a different factor. There's no amount of giving that's ultimately going to support that. And for me, this kind of integration of some of these lessons around helper patterns and kind of taking care of ourselves before we take on the role of taking care of others also became crucial, becoming a practitioner and being responsible for my own originally caseload of dozens, then ultimately, overseeing OHC in the care of hundreds and anyone by about 1,000 people. So there's as a kind of recovered helper, let's say, there's a lot of potential in terms of the progress that can be made. It's a journey, it takes time, be gentle with yourself in that process. And just the more clearly you can see it and the more you can recognize these patterns when they're happening, that will be a really helpful factor in starting to make some actively different choices in terms of how you interact with people. So I hope that's been useful. I'm just looking at the diary. I think next week we have next week we're going to try something new. I'm going to do an interview with someone who's been a patient at OHC about their recovery story. We did earlier in the year, Emma Donoghue, who presented the BBC documentary series, we did a bit of that there, and I want to go deeper into this. For those of you that watched that live, it was excruciatingly painful for the first 20 minutes because I couldn't get the technology to work. So I'm somewhat hoping that it won't be quite so torturous next time. But if you would like to see what happens, and if I end up in an abyss of technical nightmares, then feel free to tune in around 6 o'clock next week. So thank you for watching, everyone, and I will hopefully talk with you then. Bye-bye for now.